Okay, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. As you can see, it's me rather than Keith who's doing the presentation. We're giving another joint presentation this afternoon, and Keith's got the short straw for that one. So you're lumbered with me here. Yeah. Oops, wrong one. Yeah, it's just a standard disclaimer. Although I work for the MCA, I'm more or less here on my own bat. In fact, I'm not sure if they know I'm here. So I took a week's holiday, and so these are very much my own opinions rather than the MCA's official policy. So I just want to get that straight. What's the rough plan? I've got a sort of a background of why we're presenting the paper now, and I'll explain that later on. SOLAS 2009 have worked out yesterday that there's been sort of 4 phases of development of the SOLAS 2009 regulations, leading right up to SOLAS 2020, which came into force on the 1st of January this year. This paper, by the way, many apologies for the lateness of delivery and not getting into the transactions. It was always going to be a bit tight because I wanted to get the information from the last SDC 7 meeting into the paper, and it's only after a month, and then those various factors started to kick in, which made it very late, and even the presentation is a bit late, so many apologies for that. And thank you for Jamie and Rena for being so supportive in reassuring us that we were not being a nuisance by being late. So yes, so what the paper focuses on is the output from SDC 6 and SDC 7, and I'll explain later on what phase 3 means. Yeah, basically SDC 6, we discussed some changes to the regulations, and SDC 7, which just finished, was relating to changes to the explanatory notes, mostly associated with what we'd done at SDC 6. Then I'll just make some final thoughts and conclusions. Yeah, so why we're presenting this paper now? Well, it's more or less the end of an era, because this whole process of changing from deterministic to probabilistic damage stability has been in process for a very long time, an amazingly long time actually, from the first idea to finally getting to SOLAS 2020. And yeah, the final piece was agreed, SDC 2, SDC 7, the explanatory notes, and for the first time for a long time there'll be no intersessional correspondence group in this year, and no damage stability agenda at SDC 8, which is first time for many, many years. Also, a lot of the people involved with this over the years have either retired or are about to retire. Probably the most notable one is Jim Person. Some of you may know him, US Coastguard guy, who's done a tremendous amount of work chairing the working groups at SDC and the correspondence group. So yeah, it seems like a good time to take stock of where we are and what the future might hold. Yeah, it's a huge backlog of work behind all these changes. It's not only the correspondence group and the working groups, but a lot of research work's been done to trying to refine and perfect these regulations, the damage stability regulations. And what I thought I would do in this paper, which you'll see in the appendix, is to try to make a list of what changes have occurred to the 2009 probabilistic regulations. So we've actually had a phase of about 10 years under which these regulations have held sway. And now, from the 1st of January this year, we're moving into the 2020 era. This is just a sample of what we do. We've got the regulation subject, what's been amended, and an attempt at why the amendments had to be made. And there's about 4 pages of these, and you'll see in the paper. And people might say, well, this is horrific, you know, we've got 2009 regulations, and all these things are wrong with it, or have to be corrected. What's been going on? Well, to be honest, although the whole thing's been going on a long time, there was a feeling, I think, that the 2009 regulations were a little bit rushed towards the end, and it was a hugely complex task. I don't think people realized at the time what they'd undertaken, and also there was a focus on the damage stability aspect, which is in part B1, which is immensely complicated and difficult. There's pages in SOLAS. This is the version of SOLAS that we were talking about. 2014 consolidated edition showing horrendous formulae, and most people just sort of back off, think this is awful. But there were people who knew what was going on there, and good luck to them. Certainly there's whole areas of this that I know very little about. So it's not an easy subject. Yeah, as I say, there's several pages of those amendments. Keith and I have tried to keep Rena up to date with what's been going on at IMO. Yeah, we've presented papers at the previous damage conferences. But this one, as I said, will focus on what happened at SDC 6 and SDC 7. And I'm afraid I have to assume some knowledge of the damage stability terminology. There's earlier papers that have full explanations of all the terminology, but I'm afraid I'll have to assume that you know a little bit about it. So I had a stroke of genius on the train yesterday coming down, thinking, well, actually, SOLAS 220, you can look at it in terms of 4 phases. Beginning in 1995 to 2009, that was the period of the first thoughts about harmonizing the existing deterministic passenger ship regulations with the probabilistic dry cargo ship regulations, and also phasing out the A265, which was a probabilistic equivalent to the old SOLAS. It was SOLAS 90. So that was the first phase, ending in SOLAS 2009 amendments, which introduced the probabilistic harmonized concept for the first time. So immediately after that, they'd already built up a list of problems. They called it the parking lot. These were things that they didn't have time to put right before SOLAS 2009, but they were ready and waiting immediately after 2009 came into force to start making corrections and improvements. And I reckon that that phase culminated in the uplift in required index R, and that's quite a major thing, because the required index governs the overall safety level that the ship is supposed to meet. Later on, well, actually in the paper there's figure 5, you'll see, has shows clearly the uplift that occurred to R, and it's really quite significant, especially in ships in the length range of about 180 to 200 meters. So that's including RoPax ships and passenger ships. So that was a major phase, and up to that point, the objective of the deterministic conversion to probabilistic was that the probabilistic had to maintain the same level of safety. It didn't want to cause the probabilistic regulations to either lower or increase the level of safety in comparison with deterministic 2009. But during the course of this phase 2, we realized that we were going to have to take that restraint away. And that's why the R increase happened. But that had to be agreed with everybody that it was necessary to remove this constraint. And that was proven by loads of research projects. We have another paper describing what went on there. Tremendous amount of work done. Now, I've got phase 3. Once R had increased, another major area of contention was that part B1, which includes the probabilistic regulations, had created, if you like, inconsistencies with the old deterministic parts B2 and B4, which assumed a level of water tightness or weather tightness in the areas like the bulkhead deck and above, whereas the probabilistic regulations allow you to have holes, if you like, in decks and bulkheads, as long as you account for them in the calculations. But it turned out that there's quite a lot of anomalies left because, we didn't really have time to consider all these elements. We're so busy with getting the part B1 right. So that's the bit that we're looking at in this paper. And then from the 1st of January this year, we've got phase 4, where we're slowly trying to correct some of these anachronisms, if you like, and also free to introduce other regulations. So that work is going on, but not in the immediate future. So I'll explain what phase 3, it's the final changes to SOLAS 2009 in the explanatory notes, leading up to the 2020 amendments. SDC 6, we did the regulatory changes. SDC 7, we dealt with the corresponding explanatory notes, which are described in quite some detail in the paper. So I'll only just quickly run through what we did at SDC 6. You can find out more in the paper. First of all, I mentioned this inconsistency between part B1 and part B2. Now this part B1 allows you to do calculations on, say, a bulkhead deck which has openings in, and as soon as you have to have the openings defined in the program, and if they lead to spaces from which downflooding may occur, and you don't account for the flooding of the spaces in the calculation, then this is regarded as what they call an S equals 0 case, which means that case will make no contribution to the attained index. Whereas part B2, regulation 17, which applies only to passenger ships, sort of is still based on the old assumption that the structure above the bulkhead deck has watertight integrity. not only the deck itself, but the watertight bulkheads, etc. Now that's quite a major anomaly, if you like, which has to be resolved, and it has been resolved. Not immediately, but by 2024, ships constructed after that date, passenger ships will have to, Regulation 17 will be done probabilistically. So it's a complicated way of doing it, but it was the only way it could be done. So it's not an immediate change, but it will come in. Yeah, another random item was it was found that the pipes penetrating collision bulkheads on cargo ships were actually many times fitted with butterfly valves rather than screw-down valves. And many people said that screw-down valve replacement parts were difficult to get. And then, so it's a case really of the regulations following actual practice. And what we've done is there with that regulation is to relax that requirement for screw-down valves or butterfly valves, and we've just made it a general, valve rather than specific valve types. So that's again coming in 2024. The next item was the indicators on the navigation bridge, which shows the position of the status of the watertight doors with associated audible and visual alarms. However, somebody from the cruise industry said, well, we already have to fit a safety centre according to regulation 2223, so why can't we make that the place where all these controls are? And that was generally agreed to. So the wording has been relaxed. It's not just a navigation bridge, it's the safety centre, which is where this should occur. And the same discussion went on about the location of the onboard computer as well, because that seemed to be also a sensible place to put the computer. Yeah, 2.4 is to do with the water tightness of gangway, cargo and fueling ports on the ship's side below the bulkhead deck. That is being relaxed slightly to say that it has to be as tight as the surrounding shell, which should be watertight actually, but it's just a slight rewording. But there is a specification now that such doors should open outwards so that less danger of them yielding to the pressure of water from the outside. Yeah, somehow Regulation 16, which is the construction and testing of watertight enclosures, such as doors, etc., had missed out hatches. So quite important. So hatches have now been put into Regulation 16. And then something which has bothered me for quite a long time is Regulation 17-1, which is to do with the ramps, predominantly the vehicle ramps on ro-ro passenger ships. Now, obviously, this arises from the change from the deterministic regulations to the probabilistic regulations. It's to do with the way you do the damage stability calculations. In theory, a compartment that you consider damaged is well, it's supposed to be watertight. That's the definition of a compartment. It says somewhere in SOLAS. But making the ramp either weathertight or watertight is not not particularly easy. And there has been a feeling that many people, and that would include me, would still regard the bulkhead deck as being a watertight boundary. So you would damage the space below and damage the space above independently. But actually this is saying no, that's not necessarily the case. You have to do the probabilistic calculations on the assumption that water can either upflood or downflood through any openings, particularly in the ramp. Now the ramp is a major structural item. Making it weathertight is quite difficult, but it does say now that if you want to consider the bulkhead deck as a watertight boundary, then the ramp has to be watertight, which I don't know if the RoRo operators will like that very much, but that is what the regulations are now saying, or clarifying. They've always been saying it, but it wasn't too clear, I don't think. Damage control, 2.7, damage control information available to the master, and should be include the safe return to port regulation 813 regarding onboard stability computers. So, in other words, a list of damage control information should include reference to the onboard stability computer if that's fitted. Not all are fitted, but safe return to port is SRTP. It's a certain size of passenger ship. This again is to do with closure of gangway ports and cargo ports, etc. And this also, Regulation 22.6, omitted references to hatches, so they are now included. And as soon as hatches are mentioned, there's worry about when the hatches may be opened, because people sometimes need to get through hatches after the voyage commences. So they had to put a provision in to say that they could be open for short periods of time for access when the ship needed work doing, etc. So that's clarified that regulation. So I mentioned that SDC 6 made those regulatory changes. SDC 7 more or less made the equivalent changes to the explanatory notes. The 3.1 has always been this slight vague wording. This is about pipes and valves going through bulkheads and decks, and in order to be considered as part of the watertight boundary, if you like, when you're doing the damage stability calculations, the pipe or valve have to be as close as possible to the bulkhead or deck, and that was wording which IX I think didn't like very much, so they asked if we could have a specified number for what that's meant. So we've now got in a figure of 450 millimeters. That's the back end of the valve, can be no more than 450 millimeters from the bulkhead, and that's in figure 4 in the paper. Yeah, there's passenger ships have to have guidance on which watertight doors may be opened during navigation, because it was appreciated some time ago that if you do leave watertight doors open and you suffer a damage and you don't get the doors shut quickly enough, then the whole critical kg situation for the ship changes, and what may have been a safe position if the door was shut can turn into the catastrophic situation, which has happened many times. So there are now guidance notes on how to account for that. Certain doors may be open, less critical doors, but the critical doors must be closed, and there has to be guidance. But this was never clear whether it's applied to cargo ships, and it's now confirmed that it doesn't apply to cargo ships, so there's no guidance on the watertight doors of cargo ships. 23.6 is about the movement of cargo during navigation on rural passenger ship, and this is relating to when accesses may be opened on ro-ro ships during navigation, and essential working of the ship does not mean that you're allowed to have accesses open during the voyage. They're very strict about that on ro-ro passenger ships because of problems in the past. Yes, I mentioned this inconsistency between Part B1, B2. Well, this led to a whole new raft of explanatory notes, which I find difficult to understand and certainly to explain. So I sort of skirted over that one a little bit. But suffice to say that there are a lot of new explanatory notes on this business about watertight doors above the bulkhead deck. There is a nice diagram in figure 1 in the paper which does explain a little bit of how that works. I think it's sorted out now, but we'll see. So I'm coming to the end now. Yeah, we're just hoping that what we've done to 2009 will result in increased safety. But of course, it immediately raises the question of, are the SOLAS 2009 ships safe? Well, you can only go on experience, and so far they seem to be holding up okay. But there will be a step change in safety from 1/1/20. So the SOLAS 2020 ships should be even safer, but we just hope that the older ones carry on safely for the rest of their careers. As I said, I think the sort of hinge point of this whole change was the increase in R governing the overall safety level. Hugely complicated. There was a lot of debate at IMO about this. All sorts of different lines were produced, and sometimes you wondered where they came from, but finally we settled on the one that's shown in the figure. But certain classes of ships, I think it's probably especially hit the ro-ro ships about 180 meters long, are going to suffer something like a 17% uplift in R, which has caused quite a lot of head scratching, especially on ships with ro-ro ships with long lower holds. I think there hasn't been much, I may be wrong here, but I don't think there's been much ordering done. I think people are waiting to see how things work out. And also related to that is the future of the Stockholm Agreement, covering water on the deck. That's another huge debate that's gone on. We thought the SOLAS 2009 regulations might have automatically included provision for water on the deck, but it turned out a lot of research showed that actually it didn't. So the EU decided to keep the Stockholm Agreement going alongside 2009, and they've been doing a research project recently to try to establish if they can drop the Stockholm Agreement, but it's still not conclusive. And as we speak, the Stockholm Agreement still applies to 1/1/20 ships. And we're expecting a decision fairly soon from the EU on that. Right. I apologise for the next slide. That was Keith's fault. But we couldn't resist the and beyond idea. Immediately made us think of our friend Buzz. So that's it, but I'm happy to take any questions.